Today, as we wind up David's Psalms that have a specific situation attached to them, we're back in the cave. Seems like David spent a lot of his days in the cave. Maybe some of you do as well. I think I've spent a few days in the cave too, my entire senior year. In high school. I had 4 senior years in college. You too? But my whole entire high school career, I think, was spent in a cave. I was depressed. I was angry. I was moody. It may just be I was a teenage boy. I don't know. But I was all of those things that I did not want to be. There have been times since then that I think I've spent a great time depressed. Following my freshman year in college, I was back home. I had gotten out of my funk when I went to college and made friends and wanted to be somewhere else, and I was at home and there was nothing there, and I was just angry at everything. There are times when we spend huge amounts of time in the cave. Alone, isolated, feeling depressed. I don't know if you go through this, but if you do, you know what it's like to be all alone in the world. Well, David did too. And he spends his entire psalm here trying to figure out how to get out of the cave. Now, if you've ever gone caving, spelunking as the fancy folks call it, they tell you something. They say if you go down in the cave and you turn off all the lights, your eyes don't adjust because it's just pitch black. There's no light at all. So your eyes don't dilate or undilate or change at all. They just stay the same. And you turn the lights back on and you don't have to go, like you do when you wake up, trying to scrunch up your eyes and trying to see what you can see. I don't know that David's coming out of his darkness, out of his cave into the light was that easy. I think it took some strain, and we'll see some of that strain as he goes through this psalm. He really doesn't get around to asking God for something until about 3/4 of the way through this psalm. I think it takes a little longer to let our eyes adjust to God's light than it does for our eyes to adjust in a cave's light. The focus in this psalm is on David's complete isolation. For some reason, he felt entirely alone. And if you've ever felt alone, you know that you can feel alone inside an entire group of people. That hundreds and thousands of people can be around you and running by you and talking about you and going about their daily life, and you can still feel alone. And because of this, David will become to realize that he is entirely dependent upon God. If he is absolutely alone, then the only help that he has is the Lord. That's not a bad place to be. When you think that you've got a lot of props in this world and you've got a lot of things that can take care of you, that you have a lot of resources, a lot of those people don't really think that they need God. But when you are all alone and feel like you're all alone and there is no help for you, and you realize that God is there for you, that is a very good spot to be. David has nowhere else to turn but to the Lord. The psalm begins with an intent to cry out. It begins with talking about praying. Not really praying, but talking about it. And I think that's an interesting thing. It goes on to describe David's needs. And then he actually, in verse 5, he starts to get to the actual cry to God, appealing for God's attention. And then the last couple of verses are this understanding that God is there and that God will be there. And he pleads that God will bring glory to himself. One author said, in the midst of David's isolation, the worshiper reaches out with trembling hands and with a heart full of childlike trust for the one last support left to him. And I know there are probably days when you have felt like that too. This psalm also uses many phrases and words from other psalms, especially Psalm 141 and 143, They linked these three psalms together in the scriptures because they use similar phrases. David, I believe, knows the Word of God, and he calls on those words when he is praying. You know, much like people do nowadays. You ever hear, every once in a while we still hear a prayer who prays in King James English. David prays in the psalms that he knew. He prays in the words that he knew. And that is an excellent thing to do. Now, going back to the beginning, verses 1 and 2 address other people rather than God. An interesting place to start. You know, come on, you go directly to God. Why are you talking to other people? Why are you messing around? Why are you waiting? Just go straight talking to God. Which suggests that this is one of those psalms that is composed to be read in a public group of people. It also suggests that David is feeling isolated even when he's surrounded. And we may have to learn a lesson about letting God overhear our prayers. There are lots of people praying. But David still feels all alone. He felt so because this psalm seems to come from actually I think that should be 2 Samuel. No, it can't be right. It's 1 Samuel 22. Where David was hiding out. One of those many times when he was stuck in a cave. It starts off with this declaration of intent to cry out to God. I cry aloud to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out my complaint before Him. Before Him I tell my trouble. 4 times David relates his intention to pray. Not really to pray yet, but his intention to pray. And he uses very forceful words. And they're in a form that is very forceful. He is crying out, and he is appealing, and he is pouring out, and he is proclaiming. It's that last one that I think is kind of strange. A person usually proclaims about what God has done in the past when he's already answered the prayer, and not at the beginning. I think what David is doing here is he's proclaiming what he wants God to do. He's proclaiming his need, and not the fact that he is proclaiming what God has already done for him. The center of each of those lines is God, is the Lord. The center of our prayers needs to be the Lord. I cry out to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before Him. I tell Him, before Him I tell my trouble. He says he uses his voice to cry out. And now, what else would you use? You know, I've heard strange things said about voices. You know, it's like some people say, well, you have to pray your prayers aloud because if you pray silently, Satan can't hear you. And